In response to a decline in the number of students electing to take non-compulsory music education across the nation, the Australian federal government announced a national review of school music education in 2004. The review found that there was a perception that school music was approaching a state of crisis, and that inequitable practices disproportionately advantaged students of racial and economic privilege. Students reported that their music education was unengaging and irrelevant to the music that they loved and listened to, and teachers reported feeling burnt out trying to teach concepts associated with art musicianship to largely unreceptive student cohorts. This phenomenon mirrored that which Lucy Green had observed in the UK, after noting that the retention rate from compulsory to non-compulsory music education there was around 7%, and this was in the early 2000s. In response, she interviewed students who elected not to continue music education and popular musicians working within genres these students connected to, and found that despite not taking music as a school-level subject, these young musicians were highly involved in music listening and music making, namely in the form of garage bands. These groups would meet outside of school hours to rehearse, compose, and perform popular music. In other words, these groups of students who had decided that formal music education in their schools was not relevant or worth their time were demonstrating extremely high levels of self-efficacy, and many had developed quite high levels of popular musicianship. So, Green posed the question, if these students are not learning their craft within school music classrooms, how was it that they were learning? Green's 2001 study, which culminated in the book How Popular Musicians Learn, A Way Ahead for Music Education, and subsequent replication of that study with larger and more diverse participant cohorts, noted 5 characteristics of informal learning outside of the classroom. 1. These musicians would learn musical concepts and technical skills from their peers. One guitarist would come to the rehearsal with a riff, and the other would say, can you teach me how to play that? Where do I put this finger? The next week, that guitarist might learn a rhythmic concept from the drummer, and this differed greatly from the paradigm of classroom music education, which tended to be highly teacher-centred and often employed Freire's conception of a banking model of education. In the classroom, the teacher was often considered the holder of all knowledge, and students were positioned as the receivers of their expertise rather than teachers themselves. 2. Popular musicians placed a high emphasis on oral learning skills before and at times in lieu of the development of 5-line Western notation reading. This differed greatly from the dominant discourses of classroom music education, which tended to place a heavy focus on so-called musical literacy, particularly early on in a student's musical career. 3. When learning music outside of the classroom, musicians would gravitate towards learning music within genres they are connected to. A guitarist who loved rock music would learn Arctic Monkeys solos, and a drummer who was into hip-hop might learn Anderson .Paak fills. And they would seek out musicians with similar musical tastes to them to form musical groups. However, Green noted that within classrooms there tended to be an emphasis on teacher-selected musics, and these were often styles that educators connected to or felt the most comfortable teaching. When noting that the majority of music teachers are formally trained art musicians, the music was often art music, but not always. However, Gayton, Lyons and Green note that when teachers introduced popular music into their classrooms within these paradigms, there was a tendency to select music from their own adolescence or genres that they connected to. In Green's examples, these were the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, and these musics often differed greatly from the genres students were actually listening to. Popular musicians tended to learn technical and musical skills as they needed them, often to be able to play a song that they loved in a way that sounded like the recording. A guitarist learning Under the Bridge by the Red Hot Chili Peppers is likely to know how to play an E major 7 chord, as this is an integral part of the song. They might not know how to play an E minor triad or the theoretical underpinning of extension chords, but that's because they haven't needed to know these concepts to play this song. Green notes that this kind of non-sequential, non-teleological learning is the hallmark of informal music learning, but this is not how we think about the pacing or sequencing of formal classroom instruction, in which a relatively rigid sequence is often employed. To learn an extended chord before knowing all your triads, or a blues scale before you've memorised your major scales, would often be considered poor practice, or more likely would not be considered at all to get our Bernstein on. And finally, students outside of the classroom tended to learn performance, composition, improvisation, and analysis skills concurrently and holistically. This differed from dominant classroom practice, which tended to separate these skills into distinct categories that are explored in isolation. We study a composition unit from weeks 1 to 4, and then performance between weeks 4 and 5, and so on. In response to this research, and with continued funding from the Paul Hanlon Foundation, Green co-founded the organisation Musical Futures, with the aim to determine what a classroom music education built from these characteristics of popular music learning would look like. Rather than employing a teacher-centered classroom practice, the Musical Futures model split students into self-selected garage band type groups, where students would learn music they connected to on instruments relevant to those genres. The teacher would serve as a facilitator in this model, helping students to develop the musical techniques required to learn their chosen songs, often in a non-teleological way. Though Green and Musical Futures refer to this model as informal music learning, Alsop and Vakiva problematise the use of this term. They argue that the use of this term when referring to practices in formal spaces, which school classrooms are by definition, is inauthentic. Thus, to further cement the distinction between informal music learning outside of the classroom and the models of classroom instruction Musical Futures advocates for, I refer to this model as informal music pedagogy, or IMP. Throughout my proposed research and the proposal document, I also refer to the concept of popular music education, or PME. This refers to models which apply some but not all of the criteria associated with IMP to classroom instruction. For example, the popular music education model of modern band utilises many of these characteristics, but exists within a largely teacher-centred classroom space with less focus on peer-to-peer learning and utilises a whole class large ensemble. This is one example of the way PME methods may employ some of the characteristics associated with IMP whilst rejecting some others. Of course, there are countless ways to do this. Musical Futures became a kind of educational phenomenon across the UK and later globally. Namely, in response to research, we found that students within this model demonstrated high levels of engagement, retention between compulsory and non-compulsory music education, increased psychosocial well-being, and fewer observed behavioural issues. Studies from Hallam et al. And later Genert in the Australian context also noted high levels of teacher job satisfaction when PME and IMP models were employed. In noting that the Musical Futures model addressed many of the issues and recommendations found within the National Review of School Music Education, the government sponsored a pilot study to explore the applicability and outcomes of PME and IMP to Australian classrooms. In my home state of Victoria, the location of this proposed research, 10 schools took part in this pilot program. Genert's assessment of the outcomes of this program and other research taking place in the nation since noted similar results to similar studies found in the UK, including high levels of student engagement, retention, and teacher satisfaction. So, when the government released a parliamentary review into the extent, benefits, and potential of music education in Victorian schools in 2013, and announced a tender process to fund external organisations to aid in meeting the review's recommendations, which were to foster more inclusive, culturally relevant, and engaging music programs, Musical Futures put forward an application. In 2014, the Labour government committed to funding a nation-specific chapter of Musical Futures, referred to as Musical Futures Australia. In announcing this funding, the then opposition leader and current state premier stated, "I can't speak more highly about the Musical Futures program. It's done a great job in a couple of hundred schools. I want it to be at every school." The majority of this funding was devoted to the training of in-service educators, with access to a free professional development program run by Musical Futures Australia, available to all Victorian school music teachers between 2016 and 2019. This program was accessed by 1,561 teachers across 869 schools, representing 55% of all schools in the state. So at least one teacher in over half of the schools in Victoria chose to access this professional development provided by Musical Futures Australia. As a researcher and as an academic, this serves as an incredibly interesting phenomenon that is largely unexamined through a scholarly lens. The vast majority of research exploring PME and IMP aims to either problematise paradigmatic practice as it exists before these models are implemented, or discuss student or teacher outcomes after PME or IMP models have been introduced. There is very little research exploring this transition period and a teacher's experience in moving from one paradigm of instruction to another. Thus, my research aims to explore what prompts a music educator to undergo this transition process in the first place. In particular, I'm interested in whether the legitimation of PME and IMP through state government policy prompted a willingness to instate these methods within the practice of Victorian music teachers. Has the state government's advocacy for these methods as best positioned to increase engagement and retention prompt educators to more readily consider changing from formalised paradigms to these models? My second research question aims to explore what the transition process looks like once a teacher has made the decision to attempt to instate IMP and PME within their practice. What are the factors they face that make this transition more difficult or serve as barriers to change, represented here as a hurdle? And what are the factors which serve as facilitators or make the process of change more smooth or likely? This is represented by one of those arrow tiles you drive over in Mario Kart to make you go really fast. This isn't my best visual metaphor, but it's the one I've got. Shout out to my Mario Kart competitors in the audience. And lastly, I would like to understand how music educators who have successfully made this transition process navigated these barriers to change and made use of the presence of facilitators to make this transition possible. But I want to stress that I do not conceptualize these barriers and factors as linear or distinct phenomenon. Rather, I consider them dialectic networks of social, ideological, professional, structural, and/or organizational factors which influence teacher practice at the individual level. They act upon and influence one another, and they do so in ways which are context and individual specific. Because of a tendency to explore the before and after of IMP and PME within scholarly literature, there's not a lot of research exploring exactly what these barriers and facilitators might be. Within those studies which do explicitly identify barriers or facilitators to change, these phenomena are not the focus of research questions. The dissertation research of Martina Vazel and Donna Hewitt note that teachers report that the amount of physical classroom space a teacher has access to, the amount of budget they receive, the extent to which principals support the program, and the ways in which parents perceive PME and IMP can all influence a teacher's likelihood or perceived ability to instate such methods. All of these factors could be either barriers to change or facilitators. What we know is that these factors are dialectic. Administrative support may influence the amount of space that is allocated to a music program. Whether or not there is space to offer in a school will influence administrative support. Resistance toward these programs from parents may influence the budget devoted to the music program. So it's not as simple as listing all these barriers and facilitators to change and the ways in which teachers have overcome them in the past. This research acknowledges that factors informing in teacher practice are more complex than that. But we must also consider the ways in which a teacher's own ideology, confidence, experience, and values serve as facilitators or barriers to change. There could be almost no barriers to change, but a teacher's perception of PME or IMP may stop them from implementing these methods within their own practice. There exist both contextual and individual factors within this dialectic network, which influence the ways a teacher responds to policies advocating for the use of PME and IMP within the Victorian classroom. This study will employ Bourdieu's concept of hysteresis and our very own Patrick Schmidt's conceptualization of policy know-how to explore the research questions. Each of these primary theoretical concepts are informed by originating theories, namely Bourdieu's theory of practice and the concept of policy from below. To investigate the ways in which government advocacy for PME and IMP may prompt teachers to embrace or resist change, and to explore the ways in which one's own dispositions may serve as barriers or facilitators on this pathway, we're going to begin with our Bourdieu. Bourdieu's theory of practice argues that human behaviour or practice is informed by three interrelated concepts: field, capital, and habitus. Field refers to the physical or non-physical space in which behaviour takes place. The field may have physical boundaries like a school ground or be conceptualised more abstractly, like referring to the field of music education. Capital refers to the skills, knowledges, and possessions considered valuable within a particular field. The more capital one has, the more status, position, or power they are afforded. It's important to note that different fields may value similar or different types of capitals. In the context of this research, we note that the field of music education often has a tendency to value similar capital to the field of art musicianship. Things like the ability to identify a composer of a canonic work that's playing, high levels of technical proficiency on a single instrument, or a person's sight reading skills are likely to serve as capital and thus increase one's status in the field of art musicianship and as a classroom music teacher. In contrast, Hannon, Bradbury, and Herbst and Albrecht note that the capitals considered of value within the field of popular music often differ from those valued highly within art musicianship. Things like improvisational skills, oral learning abilities, or knowledge of the digital recording process may be valued to some extent within the field of art musicianship, but are unlikely to garner you increased status if you're not able to sight read or play an instrument with high technical ability. Similarly, your ability to sight read perfectly is unlikely to lend you increased status as a popular musician if you can't also follow a lead sheet or orally recreate riffs, capitals which are considered more valuable within this field. And finally, habitus refers to one's disposition to act in ways which demonstrate the types and amount of capital they possess. Bourdieu argues that such dispositions are learned unconsciously through experience and have a tendency to reinforce the value of capital a person already has. Powell-Smith and Diamore and our own Ruth Wright argue that a music educator's habitus is highly likely to be informed by capital valued within the field of art musicianship. Is it due to requirements that one demonstrate their position of art music-centered capitals within the audition criteria of teacher preparation programs? Once entered into these programs, the value of capital associated with the field of art musicianship is also unquestioned within art music dominant course material. Thus, a formally trained educator whose habitus predisposes them to perpetuate the value of art music-centered capital may teach their students that the ability to read 5-line Western notation is essential to musical success. 1, because this has been true for them in the fields that they have occupied as musicians. 2, because they've not been placed in environments which force them to question the applicability of this notion outside of the art music field. And 3, because they have a vested interest in students, parents, teachers, and the field of music education more generally, continuing to value capital that they already possess. When considering that paradigmatic music practices are informed by the field of art musicianship, a congruence between the habitus of formally trained music educators and the capital they are expected to perpetuate in their classrooms is noted. Bourdieu argues that this lack of friction often leaves paradigmatic practices unquestioned and alternatives unexplored. However, Bourdieu and Yang note that paradigmatic change is possible, and list the phenomenon of hysteresis as one way in which this change can be prompted. Bourdieu notes that hysteresis occurs when the capital value within a field changes. In the context of this research, the advocacy of the use of PME and IMP by the Australian government has seen capitals associated with popular musicianship holding increased value within the field of music education. Suddenly, a teacher's ability to sight read or recognise works from 19th century composers lends them less status in the educational field. Not no status, but less status than it previously did, because these knowledges and skills are less likely to be of practical use within a classroom employing PME or IMP. However, as Bourdieu notes, a person's habitus is durable, and therefore the predisposition to perpetuate the value of capital associated with art musicianship is likely to remain. This causes a sense of unease amongst teachers, as the environment that they encounter is too different from the one to which they are objectively adjusted. The habitus of these teachers has not predisposed them to possess or value the types of capitals you are required to demonstrate when employing PME or IMP within practice. Their dispositions are out of line with the field and with the collective expectations which are constitutive of normality, even if this is considered a new normal. Courtney notes that there are 3 ways in which those whose status and position are at risk due to hysteresis can respond. They can attempt to force field conditions to return to those which suited their habitus. They advocate for the use of formalised methods which value the capitals associated with art musicianship that they already possess, or they resist change. Second, they might engage in strategies and social interactions whereby their out-of-sync habitus is realigned with what is newly necessary. They may attempt to acquire capitals in the field of popular musicianship in an attempt to gain or regain status that is at risk as the capitals valued within the field of music education are renegotiated. Notably, they're likely to do this via professional development. Or the third option is that they remain discursively and materially deprivileged through their reduced capacity to play the game according to these new rules. The field continues to change and these teachers are metaphorically left behind. In this way, hysteresis may serve as a barrier or a facilitator towards change. It may lead to the kind of active resistance to new models Cavici associates with music education, or it may prompt educators to accept that change is occurring and seek to acquire skills and knowledges associated with popular musicianship in response. However, one's initial response to change and their long-term response to it can be different. Bourdieu notes that habitus has a spontaneous tendency to perpetuate structures corresponding to their conditions of production. In my paper, I use the metaphor of a rubber band. Hysteresis may force one's habitus to stretch and contort, but a tendency to snap back to its original position and reinforce past values, ideals, and capitals is notable. However, Yang notes that a conscious awareness of one's original habitus paired with professional development exploring newly valued capitals, can lead to the development of a secondary habitus, which predisposes educators to perpetuate the value of newly acquired capital. This secondary habitus is also durable and may prevent the kind of snapback detailed by Bourdieu. However, it is at this moment unknown if the professional development sessions provided to Victorian music educators by Musical Futures Australia were able to foster the development of a secondary habitus. Have Victorian music teachers who received this professional development since snapped back to perpetuating the value of capital associated with art musicianship within their practice? Has the habitus of these educators prompted them to resist change or embrace it? I aim to explore this within my research, notably in addressing question 1. In doing so, I aim to explore the influence of the government's legitimation of PME and IMP within a policy from below framework. This approach to conceptualizing policy focuses on how policy influences teacher behaviour at the micro level and the ways in which teachers interact and dialogue with policy within their practice. Eric Shih notes that both teachers and academics have a tendency to view policy through a top-down model, in which policy is seen as something that is enforced onto teachers by figures conceptualized as above them, governments, principals, administrative teams alike. This lends little agency to teachers, whose practice is perceived as constrained by external forces in a kind of managerial system. Within this model, it's tempting to focus on these figures as agents of change and present policy as something which only flows one way onto teachers. In doing so, policy implementation is often considered friction-free. The government tells the principals tell the vice principals, and they tell the teachers, and it shall be so. But this often positions teacher practice as existing within a vacuum, uninfluenced by the presence of, at times, contradicting policies, or the unique networks of factors influencing individual practice which we explored earlier. For example, when viewing policy at the macro level, we may argue that the government's advocacy for and funding of Musical Futures Australia is a facilitator towards this change. Their legitimation of alternate methods and the provision of free professional development implies macro support for these programs. However, other educational policies stemming from the governmental level may serve as barriers towards change. Light and Kirk and Drew note that neoliberal discourses of school choice and marketability advocated for by the Australian government may see principals resist changes to paradigmatic music practice, particularly if their school is attempting to associate itself with prestige via the advertisement of art music ensembles. Similarly, policies advocating for the use of PME and IMP within schools may be facilitators to change, but its implementation within a music program without the space to employ these methods, or within communities in which parents push back against the presence of popular music within the classroom, may cause teachers to perceive this transition as incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Thus, scholars like Ball and Shih call for more research which explores the ways in which policy interacts with the numerous factors informing teacher practice at the micro level. Importantly, scholars like Western alumni Kelly Bylicker and my wonderful advisor Patrick Schmidt call for further research detailing and uncovering the ways in which policy effects are interpreted, reproduced, as well as resisted at the micro level of teacher practice. These scholars note that teachers are implicitly taught to take a passive role in the policy process, perceiving themselves as mere receivers of policy, and thus argue that their hands are tied when employing practices that they may wish to change. Schmidt argues that a teacher can learn to view policy as something that's malleable, open to interpretation, and able to be resisted from the micro level. This may give teachers the confidence and skills to speak back to policies, and see both barriers and facilitators to change as something that can be altered. However, doing so requires a knowledge of how the policy process works, a teacher's potentially active role in it, and an understanding of strategies that can be used to afford more agencies to teachers at the micro level. Schmidt positions such skills and knowledges as teachable and labels this policy know-how. Policy know-how refers to the capacity to understand, speak, and act with a policy frame of mind that is relevant to teachers, their programs, and their work. This, Schmidt argues, positions teachers as able to resist, embrace, influence, and shape policies and the ways that they impact their own teaching practice. I argue that music educators with a developed policy know-how are not just advocates of music education and its benefits, but know how to frame their practice in ways which appeal to people and institutions which may serve as barriers to change. For example, a music educator attempting to instate IMP or PME within their classroom may see a small budget for initial instrument purchases as a barrier to change, particularly if a program doesn't already have access to instruments associated with popular musicianship. But because they have a developed sense of policy know-how, they may understand the process of gaining additional funding. They may approach the principal, who they know is attempting to cut spending within the department, with research indicating that PME and IMP programs may be cheaper to run in the long term than traditional band programs, due to the need for less frequent and less expensive instrument repairs, framing a higher upfront cost as a long-term benefit. This requires a knowledge of how 5-year budgetary plans work, what discourses and pressures principals are already under, and ways to present new music education practices as a solution to an existing problem rather than the source of a new one. Or this music teacher's understanding of educational policy may see them sidestep the traditional conceptions of hierarchy within a school and apply for external grants to fund instrument purchases. Vaser notes that one participant who was hoping to gain funding for a new guitar program in her study wrote directly to the company Fender to gain a grant when their principal was unable to fulfill the request. Conceptualizing policy as something that teachers can interact with and positioning policy know-how as a tool that helps teachers interact with policy meaningfully lends agency to educators. Instead of seeing barriers to change as coming from above and as obstacles that are too great to overcome, the study utilizes a policy from below framework and explores the ways in which teachers employ policy know-how as they navigate pathways towards change. Who are they appealing to make this change possible? How are they doing so? What are their strategies, and are those strategies applicable to other contexts? To understand this process and investigate the research questions, I have to consider the methodological implications of this study. Because my research questions focus on teacher experience, the ways in which their worlds are constructed, and the meanings they attribute to these experiences, I've elected to employ a qualitative paradigm. In doing so, I'm aligning this research with pluralist ontologies, which acknowledge the potential of multiple truths in forming a textual representation of experience. This paradigm acknowledges that knowledge is both constructed and reconstructed in the context of research, and doesn't aim to determine an objective truth applicable across all cases or all contexts. I specifically decided to employ a multiple case study design, with 3 schools in the state of Victoria serving as cases. Case studies employ multiple data collection methods to form a complex representation of experience and context. They often require a prolonged period in the field and aim to understand the ways context and behaviours are intertwined. As a result, Barrett notes that case study research is particularly applicable to school settings, in which there is likely to be a considerable entanglement of phenomenon and context. This entanglement, and the way that this entanglement informs the practice of music educators, is the focus of my proposed research, and thus case study is ideally suited. I've chosen to employ a multiple case study design rather than a single case study in response to Stake's assertion that this model maximizes opportunities to learn from different cases in different contexts. Gaining multiple perspectives within multiple schools helps to reinforce that the experiences of educators are rarely homogeneous, and that their practice is informed by unique networks of social, ideological, professional, structural, and organizational factors. In employing cross-case analytical methods, this design allows experiences common across cases and unique to specific cases to be explored in depth. When paired with Yin's theoretical replication strategy, in which case-specific codes are developed prior to the development of overarching codes, multiple case study allows the uniqueness of each case to be highlighted. These analytical methods and the use of multiple data collection as a tool also allows for a critical investigation of the applicability of codes within cases. There may be multiple educators of research interest within each case, so ensuring that data and codes from one educator are not seen as generalizable to others within the same school without critical investigation is also essential to accurately represent the complexity of teaching at the individual level. Kahn and Van Weinsberger note that when planning to utilize cross-case analysis, a researcher must preemptively select cases that can be appropriately compared. Creswell and Stake argue that such cases should therefore be bounded by time, activity, and place. In response, I've developed 4 bounding criteria in my selection of schools for cases. These schools will facilitate general compulsory schooling in a high school 7 to 12 setting, position general class of music as a compulsory subject for years 7 and 8. They'll be located in the state of Victoria, and they will have at least one educator on staff who received government-sponsored professional development from Musical Futures Australia between 2016 and 2019. These cases will be purposefully selected, which allow schools in different geographic locations and those which serve different populations of their own students to be researched. A full list of schools who took part in government-sponsored professional development from Musical Futures Australia is accessible by organisational members of Musical Futures Australia. A recruitment flyer will be sent to this list of schools from the Musical Futures Australia email address. If this does not yield an appropriate number of potential cases, snowball sampling methods may be employed. At least one case in the Melbourne metro area and one within a regional city will be selected. These 3 cases will be selected within a 110-kilometre radius of Ballarat, Victoria, which is where I'll be based as I undertake the research. I would not explore a case within rural Victoria, 1, because of notoriously unstable and inequitable internet access in these areas, which will be a requirement if this research needs to move online, and 2, because of a lack of university-qualified music educators in rural areas identified by the Department of Education and Training. I aim to employ a typical case sampling method, in part to highlight that no school can be considered typical or average, as each is informed by unique networks of factors influencing practice. In doing so, schools which have been highlighted as having exemplary music programs within government and musical futures documents, including the National Review of School Music Education and the Parliamentary Inquiry into the Extent, Benefits and Potential of Music Education in Victorian Schools, will be excluded, as will musical futures champion schools, which are considered hubs for musical futures training and advocacy. At the beginnings of Term 2, Term 3 and Term 4 of the 2022 school year, I'll spend up to 6 weeks collecting data in each case. Weeks 1 and 4 will be focused on classroom observation, to observe the ways in which methods and approaches associated with PME and IMP are employed within the classroom of educators who receive government-sponsored professional development exploring these methods. It also allows the ways in which such methods have been altered in response to identified barriers or facilitators to change to be noted. 3 semi-structured interviews with the music teachers observed will take place across the field time. The first will explore what prompted educators to consider employing PME or IMP within their practice in the first place, and the barriers or facilitators to change that they have met whilst undergoing this process. The second will explore the extent to which educators perceive themselves as agents of change, and determine the extent to which their policy know-how has played a role in their navigation of these factors. And the final interview gives space for educators to clarify concepts and express narratives or experiences that they feel are important to informing the textual representation of their practice. Interviews with any figures that these educators identify as presenting barriers or facilitators to change will also take place. The head of the music department and administrative figures are of particular interest, as these are the figures often considered directly above educators within a top-down view of policy. The perspectives these people have on PME and IMP and music education more generally may lend insight into why some barriers and facilitators stemming from the implementation of school policy exist. The analysis of documents will also serve as a data collection method. The professional development resources provided to educators by Musical Futures Australia within government-sponsored professional development will help me to determine the extent to which lesson plans, unit plans and concepts from such sessions are implemented within the practice of research teachers. It also allows me to observe the ways in which such resources have been altered in response to barriers or facilitators to change noted within interviews. This will be supported by the analysis of both past and present lesson plans. Bernstein notes that inadvertent schooling documents are embedded with information indicating the capital position as valuable within a classroom space. In comparing past and current teaching plans, the investigation of how capital is valued within classroom practice have changed across time is possible. In response to Drew and McDonald, Pinney and Previtt's research exploring neoliberal performativity within the online presence of Australian schools, an analysis of online newsletter and social media content will also take place. This will aid in determining the extent to which discourses of marketing and school image in Australia stemming from macro-level educational policies serve as barriers or facilitators to change. And finally, in response to Vazel and Hallam et al.'s findings that budgetary restrictions often serve as barriers to change towards the use of PME or IMP, both rejected and approved budgetary documents will be analysed. This allows a way that budget serves as a barrier or facilitator to change to be investigated and highlights the type of instruments, technologies and resources considered of value by teachers proposing the budget and administrators who choose to accept or reject these requests. Before exploring how I aim to curate trustworthiness within this research, I want to take a moment to talk about my positionality as a researcher. Cohen, Mannanon, and Morrison and Cresswell note that a researcher's experiences, values, and ideologies are likely to inform and influence the ways data is collected, analysed, interpreted, and discussed. I do not claim to or aim to position myself as an objective figure in this research. That is both impossible and counterintuitive when using a qualitative paradigm. However, in presenting my statement of researcher reflexivity, I aim to make the reader aware of the ways in which my experiences as a student, teacher, and proponent of PME and IMP may influence this research. Afterwards, I'll explore the ways in which I will use methods associated with developing credibility, authenticity, criticality, and integrity to mitigate the potential for this positionality to bias the research endeavour. If you want to read along with the full researcher positionality reflexive statement, you can do so by scanning this QR code. I'm going to read it in full now. I attended a public high school situated in a suburb of low socioeconomic status in the regional city of Ballarat, Victoria, the state in which these participants are located. The school utilised methods associated with PME and IMP throughout the junior, middle and senior years, including modern band methods and those associated with Green's conception of IMP. I believe that the employment of such methods benefited me greatly as a musician, scholar, and person, fostering lifelong connections with the people and musics engaged with across this time. I believe that the curation of skills, knowledges, and practices associated with popular musicianship during my high school experience contributed to my career as a professional popular musician, an experience I benefit from personally and financially. Throughout my teaching career, I identified as an educator employing methods associated with PME and IMP across all high school year levels. I found the use of such methods personally and professionally rewarding and promoted their use within professional development and conference sessions. I acknowledge that my identity as a past and present teacher, student, and proponent of PME and IMP may predispose me to present these methods in ways that confirm past positive experiences. Similarly, I notice that though my identity as a music educator may help to develop researcher-participant rapport in this study, there is potential that my own teaching experiences may be unconsciously projected onto collected data. Seeing as my positionality has the potential to bias my interpretation of collected data, putting measures in place to establish trustworthiness is essential. In response to Fade and Maxwell, who criticised the use of the terms reliability and validity within qualitative research due to their association with positivist ontologies, I will explore these methods via Whitemore et al.'s 4 criteria for establishing trustworthiness in qualitative research: credibility, authenticity, criticality, and integrity. Credibility aims to assure the reader that discussions within the research paper are data-derived. To establish credibility, I will employ triangulation, in which the presence of data points across multiple forms of collected data is highlighted. I will also employ inductive coding methods as a part of my coding and analysis procedure, so that any points of data discussion can be easily traced back to specific quotes from participants, documents, and observations. It also helps to establish an audit trail which can be accessed by myself, a peer reviewer, or auditor. Authenticity refers to the extent to which the research reflects the experiences of the respondents as they lived and perceived them. To establish this, I will utilise fic description, in which events and narratives are described in deep, dense detail. This will be paired with member-checking efforts, employed at all stages of the research process to ensure participants believe that their experiences are being represented accurately within data discussion. Criticality is conceptualized as the willingness and ability to critique one's own analysis and/or conclusions. To establish this, I will actively seek disconfirming evidence, looking for data points which contradict my own expectations or pre-established code. I'll also utilize access to my wonderful dissertation team, peer reviewers, and if needed, external reviewers to ensure that any alternate explanations of the data that they can conceive of is considered critically and thoughtfully. And finally, integrity refers to a researcher's willingness to acknowledge their positionality and potential bias throughout the research endeavour. The curation of a reflexive positionality statement, which I read out before, the overt communication of potential bias, the keeping of reflexive researcher journals, and the detailing of approaches employed to curate research trustworthiness serve to establish researcher integrity and thus trustworthiness. Though Cresswell argues that a hallmark of qualitative research is particularity rather than generalizability, she notes that the use of multiple case study as design may facilitate what Fine labels provocative generalizability. Provocative generalizability allows the reader to connect the lived experiences of those researched to their own lives and practices, and use this connection to inform their own future actions. In the context of this research, teachers who are engaging with this research may recognise barriers and facilitators to change which are influencing their own practice. Thus, these readers are able to learn from the experiences of others, with the stories of the researched informing the future strategization and action of the reader. The aim of provocative generalizability is not to imply that all educators experience barriers and facilitators to change in the same way, but rather that these experiences of unique participants can inform the ways in which readers act in response to them in the future. Similarly, Fine explores the concept of theoretical generalizability, which posits that though qualitative research often begins with an examination of a small number of specific cases, theory built from such research is likely to be applied to other cases and contexts. Bieliker and Schmidt note that studies focusing on a small number of participants are often starting points for situating learning within larger socio-political and cultural historical contexts, and therefore may illuminate the applicability of discussed theory to new fields and environments. Thus, though this research will examine a small number of cases in depth, theories surrounding the types of factors which may influence teacher practice and potential strategies of navigating such factors may be considered applicable outside of the participant sample. This research will need to gain approval from the Western Non-Medical Research Ethics Board before any potential participants are approached. I will also need to gain an exemption from the suspension of research activities in Victorian schools currently put in place by the Department of Education and Training in response to COVID-19. I will also need to go through the Department of Education and Training's own research ethics review system. All people entering schools within the state of Victoria are required to hold a valid Working with Children's card and undergo a standard police background check. I will update these qualifications before entering any schools. The informed consent of every participant is necessary, with clear letters of information and letters of consent provided to them. All participants will be made aware of their right to withdraw from the study and have their data withdrawn from analysis at any time without personal or professional repercussions. Though no students under the age of 18 will be interviewed throughout this research, the potential to video or audio record sessions and lessons or locations in which students are located requires ethical consideration. Letters of information must be sent to legal guardians of all children observed in classes and schooling locations, with the option for guardians to opt students out of participating in research contexts and or video recording provided. As with all recordings of all the participants, student identities, names and voices will be de-identified using self-selected pseudonyms. Any identifying information, including school logos, names, or location data, will be removed from all digitized documents, research memos, notes, and recordings. You can find my proposed timeline in the original proposal document. I won't go through it in detail here, but there may be some slight changes, particularly with the state government debating whether to push back the start of term dates for the upcoming year in response to high Omicron numbers. I've elected to enter each school at the beginning of each term to minimise disruption to students and teachers and allow additional field time if it's deemed necessary. And finally, I want to send a big thank you to everyone involved in the music education program at the University of Western Ontario. All of the professors, all of those people who have helped to push my thinking have been incredible in my development as a human being, as a student, and as a scholar. I've made lifelong friendships with other scholars that are in this room that have helped to push my thinking and help me to become more critical and more thoughtful in my scholarly endeavours. I want to give particular thanks to my advisors, Dr. Patrick Schmidt and Dr. Ruth Wright, for all their wonderful advice and feedback and their pushing of me to really expand my thinking and dig deeper into very complex concepts. And to my second reader, Dr. Neril Janert, who has been giving me incredible advice on how this research will apply to the policy environment of Australia and popular music education and informal music pedagogy within that context. I'm going to open things up to questions. I really look forward to seeing what people have to say and the questions they have in response to this proposal. So let's get to that. Thank you.